As someone who's played a lot of video games over the years, it's sometimes easy to forget about the large number of games that are out there. Some of them were developed by well-known studios, had massive hype behind them, but were quietly forgotten about shortly after their release. Today I wanted to take a look back at several games that for one reason or another have been largely forgotten about by most of us, due to either delisting, disappointment, or because they just didn't stick around in players' minds beyond their very short-lived release window. Now I want you guys to leave some games in the comments section that you think many of us have forgotten about, or even you forgot about at one point but for some reason you were reminded of it suddenly. I think it's pretty cool when I finally remember or am reminded of a game I used to play back in the day. So again, be sure to drop a comment with your forgotten games. I'd definitely like to be reminded of some of the hidden gems out there. And up first on my list are the 007 games released during the 7th console generation. I'm going to do a brief history of all those games real quick. So during the years of 2006 to 2013, Activision held the publishing rights to the James Bond franchise and would produce 4 video game titles, technically 5 if we count a remake, and the first was 007 Quantum of Solace in 2008, which was a first-person shooter developed by Treyarch for the Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, and the Wii. Yes, this is Treyarch from the Black Ops franchise. The game was the first to feature Daniel Craig's voice and likeness inside the video games, and it was an alright game. Next was a title released exclusively for the Wii in 2010, simply titled GoldenEye 007, which was a bit of a reboot to the franchise. The game is a reimagining of the 1995 James Bond film GoldenEye, as well as a bit of a remake of the original 1997 game on the N64. Now at the time of its release, this game received some backlash for its Call of Duty style gameplay, but to me, this seemed quite fitting. Are the newer Bond films not just over-the-top action movies with unrealistic dangerous stunts, just like a Call of Duty game? It had a pretty good campaign, addictive online multiplayer, and classic 4-player split screen. It was a solid title, and one of the best shooters on the Wii. Alongside the release of this game, James Bond 007 Bloodstone was released for the Xbox 360 and PS3. It was a third-person action game with the first truly original story not based on previous films, and was set between the events of the Quantum of Solace game and the Skyfall film. Unfortunately, it wasn't received too well and led to the developer Bizarre Creations closing down just a few months later in 2011. Also in 2011 is when the Wii exclusive GoldenEye 007 would be ported and updated for the Xbox 360 and PS3 consoles, with additions like MI6 Ops, which were basically Modern Warfare 3's survival mode, and the multiplayer map saw expansions and additions thanks to the very improved hardware of these consoles over the Wii. And finally, 007 Legends, the last Bond game published by Activision. The game was released to coincide with the 50th anniversary of the James Bond film series, and each of the campaign missions includes one mission from each of the 6 actors' eras. The gameplay was basically unchanged from the GoldenEye 007 Reload game, but it was received to mixed reviews across the board, which led to unimpressive sales. Now here's why these games are largely forgotten about. Because shortly after this game's release in 2012, Activision would remove every single one of their James Bond titles from digital storefronts without notice on January 4th, 2013. Activision's license for the James Bond games were due to expire in 2014. However, because all of their titles were delisted at the beginning of 2013, it's been speculated that their license was revoked early. You may be able to find physical copies of these games for relatively cheap online, but digital keys are being sold at ridiculous prices. It's unfortunate that these games perform so poorly because there's actually a lot of decent ideas and gameplay found inside a few of them, and the James Bond franchise has been dormant ever since. Next up, I want to look at a game called Murdered Soul Suspect. Developed by Airtight Games and published by Square Enix, Murdered Soul Suspect released in June 2014 and sort of just came and went without much fanfare. I remember being pretty interested in this game before its release though, because it seemed like a really unique experience. The game is a stealth action adventure title with a fantastic mystery crime thriller noir setting, and it takes place in a fictionalized version of Salem, where a serial killer known as the Bell Killer begins murdering what seems like random victims. The main character, Ronan O'Connor, is a police detective and is able to track down the killer, but is thrown out of a window and shot to death during a fight with him. The game then begins with Ronan returning from the dead in the form of a ghost, where he must solve his own murder and find the killer in order to reach the afterlife where his late wife awaits him. Pretty damn cool concept. The game has you solving puzzles, possessing NPCs, and snooping around in your ghostly form in order to try and connect the dots. Now, finding all these clues means nothing if you can't tell anyone about them, so this is where the help of a medium named Joy comes in, and she's essential in helping you solve the mystery of your death. A really great concept, setting, and visual style that unfortunately didn't pan out for Square Enix, and Airtight Games, the developers would close their doors just 1 month after the game launched due to the poor sales and poor reception. Now, despite its mediocre scores, most reviewers did praise it for keeping them invested in the narrative from start to finish, and even celebrated the game's ending, but the gameplay left a lot to be desired. Pretty soon after its launch, the game was largely forgotten about, which is a real shame because I think this one had a lot of potential to be something great. Up next is another Square Enix title, Thief. Releasing in 2014, this Thief title was sort of a reboot to the classic Thief franchise from the early 2000s, and the game was set in a dark fantasy world full of Victorian and Gothic style, with a bit of a steampunk aesthetic, employing a similar art style to the world of Dishonored. You play as Garrett, a master thief who embarks on several missions focusing on stealing from the rich. Like the older Thief titles, the idea is to give players many different ways of approaching each level, action or stealth, lethal or non-lethal, utilizing equipment like water arrows to put out torches, different pathways, things like that. The game has a few positives, like the stealth mechanics, which were pretty decent actually, and it could have a high replay value if you wanted to perfect your missions, but there were a lot of drawbacks. The story was incredibly boring and frankly bad, in my opinion. The level design wasn't the best, and the game was incredibly short. Many of the older Thief fans purposely choose to ignore this game and pretend it doesn't exist, yet the game was still fairly popular amongst new fans to the franchise and managed to make impressive sales. But for some reason, it remains to be a game mostly forgotten about by gamers, and the Thief franchise remains dormant 10 years later as well. Call of Juarez Gunslinger is the fourth and seemingly final game in the Call of Juarez series, and is by far one of the greatest westerns in video games. The game is filled with over-the-top action, hilarious storytelling, and high replayability, despite the campaign being only 5 hours or so. You play as Silas Greaves, a bounty hunter in the American West during the second half of the 19th century, and you play through Silas's memories as he recalls them to a group of saloon patrons. He recounts his encounters with the Wild West legends like Billy the Kid, Pat Garrett, Jesse James, and Butch Cassidy. After the failed release of Call of Juarez The Cartel in 2011, which was a modernized take on the Wild West, Techland decided that with Gunslinger they'd go back to the proper Wild West setting, and man was that the right call. Gunslinger is just a simple arcade-style shooter with a great art style, fantastic voice acting, and addicting gunplay. The game even became a huge commercial success for Ubisoft, becoming one of their best-selling digital games. Now, the game was temporarily delisted on digital storefronts in 2018, but was relisted several months later once Techland acquired the rights to the franchise from Ubisoft. Call of Juarez is just another franchise that doesn't deserve to be forgotten, but often is, and I highly recommend picking this game up. It's currently $3 on Steam. Tom Clancy's Hawks is a franchise that was very short-lived and one that people often forget even existed. Hawks is an arcade flight combat game similar to the Ace Combat series, set in the same universe as the Ghost Recon games. And the gameplay was surprisingly good in Hawks. Where Ace Combat is a bit more hardcore and challenging, Hawks is more laid back and arcadey, allowing for some pretty over-the-top action culminating in massive explosions. Being a Tom Clancy game, the narrative is a bit more of a focus, but is still very underwhelming. Private military companies have essentially replaced government-run military in many countries, and your goal is to take out the bad guys before they can destroy various cities around the United States with nuclear weapons. Sounds pretty cool, but it just kinda isn't. Hawks released in 2009 with a sequel release just a year later in 2010, but due to poor sales and a mostly average reception, Ubisoft shelved the franchise and has yet to acknowledge its existence for over 14 years now. The Culling is one of the most forgotten Battle Royale titles. Everyone brings up Arma 2 mods and H1Z1 when discussing the origins of the Battle Royale genre, but people tend to forget just how popular the Culling was during its heyday in early 2016. 16 players were placed in an arena, either a small island or a prison, and upon completing various tasks like selling items, killing other players, traveling X amount of distances, players would earn Funk, which is the in-game currency used to craft or purchase equipment and upgrades each match. The Culling was one of the top streamed games on Twitch for a brief period of time before the release of PUBG and later Fortnite. And unfortunately after those games released, the Culling just couldn't hang on to its player base. In 2018, they tried to cash in on the genre one final time with the release of a sequel, which was essentially just a PUBG clone that cost you real-life money for each match you wanted to load into, sort of like an old-school arcade machine form of monetization. And long story short, that didn't work out for them, and they faded back into obscurity pretty quickly. While the game was never perfect, it's a pretty big piece of the story surrounding the popularity of the Battle Royale games, and people tend to forget about it. Evolve. Evolve was an asymmetrical multiplayer game which pits 4 players who play as a hunter in first person against 1 player who plays as a monster in a third person view. The game was Turtle Rock Studios' first major project after the company split from Valve in 2010, where they previously developed the Left 4 Dead games. The game didn't have a traditional campaign and instead was a purely multiplayer title. The monster player needed to grow stronger in order to fight the hunters by killing and hunting local wildlife to gain XP, which could then be used to increase maximum health and obtain new abilities. Hunters were tasked with simply tracking down the monster and killing it. There were 4 different classes: the Assault, Trapper, Support, and Medic, each having very specific toolkits and abilities. The game had a lot of potential but was marred by bugs, over-monetization, and simply not enough content to justify the price tag. The game was panned by most gamers at the time, and pretty quickly the game began to run on live support with a dwindling player base. Turtle Rock tried to save the game in 2016 by transitioning to a free-to-play model, but just a few months into trying that strategy, they announced that they would be ending the support of the game in 2018, and the game's dedicated servers were shut down. Somehow and for some reason, the servers were temporarily re-enabled in 2022, but were again taken down for the final time in 2023. Everyone was really excited to see what the Left 4 Dead developers could do with this game before it released, but unfortunately, it quickly dropped out of the spotlight after fans were very disappointed. Blacklight Retribution and Blacklight Tango Down. These games were free-to-play competitive multiplayer FPS games that released during the 7th generation of consoles. The games were set in a cyberpunk setting with typical FPS game modes like Team Deathmatch, Capture the Flag, Domination, but had really fast-paced gameplay and futuristic abilities. The Blacklight franchise traded hands from Zombie Studios in 2015 and was taken over by Hardsuit Labs, who would support the game for the next 4 years, until announcing that they wouldn't be able to continue support past 2019 and would instead focus on bigger projects. The game was suffering a very low player base and low user engagement, so it couldn't be sustained financially moving forward. Thankfully, Retribution servers are still online and occasionally you can find a game, and I used to play Blacklight Tango Down all the time back on the 360, and I forgot all about it until someone brought it up recently on Twitter. The Cabela's Hunting Games. Big Game Hunter, Dangerous Hunts, some kind of safari subtitle. We've all likely played a Cabela's Hunting game at one point. The first one I played was on the PlayStation 1, and this game right here was what would prepare me for my future love of FPS games. And it's honestly a pretty impressive hunting simulator for its time. Throughout the years, I played several different Cabela's games. Dangerous Hunts 2 on the PS2 was a favorite of mine, but until recently I forgot all about these games entirely. The games would have you tracking down trophy animals or completing hunting challenges, or in the case of Dangerous Hunts, surviving the wild animals in different regions of the world. For licensed hunting video games, these were surprisingly pretty damn good, and there was a new Cabela's game released like every 6 months. So there's dozens of these games out there. They started to slow down in 2013 and their last game was in 2018, and again I almost forgot these games existed. I had a lot of fun with them back in the day on the early PlayStation consoles. Vanquish is a fast-paced, high-intensity, full-throttle action game released back in 2010. I remember watching the commercials for this one back on TV and thinking, this game doesn't look that great, but I think the marketing really did it a disservice. Vanquish is a fantastic game with some of the most unique gameplay of the 7th console generation, but it achieved mediocre sales and only over time became appreciated. It's a solid game, I recommend checking it out, and I'll just let the gameplay speak for itself here. The Saboteur is an action-adventure game developed by Pandemic Studios, yes, the same Pandemic behind the original Battlefront games, and hidden gems like the Mercenary franchise, and The Saboteur takes place in a Nazi-occupied Paris, and is a pretty simple third-person action-adventure on the surface, but looking a bit closer you'll see the game has a lot of unique ideas. The art style employed a very interesting use of colors and integrated it into the gameplay in pretty neat ways, like the Nazi-occupied territory being represented in black and white, with the exception of German symbols which were bright red and the French resistance symbols which were bright blue, and The Saboteur was Pandemic's last game before the studio's closure, and it's likely due to the sales and reception being pretty low on its release. It was a game marred by development issues, bugs, and unfinished gameplay elements, but despite those issues, the game had some really cool ideas that I wish were able to be fully realized. But that's just a small handful of games that you may have forgotten existed. There's obviously a lot more I could name. Maybe I'll do a part 2 at some point or make this a series. I'm sure you guys have a whole lot of games you could name, so go ahead and drop some in the comment section down below. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you all in the next one.